20 minutes after the US naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz took effect, a Chinese tanker called the Rich Starry pulled out of anchorage near Sharjah and headed straight for it. The ship was flying a Malawian flag, which is a curious choice for a landlocked country with no coastline. Its AIS transponder had been spoofing its GPS position for 11 consecutive days. It was carrying 250,000 barrels of methanol, officially loaded at a UAE port, almost certainly originating from Iran. US Central Command was watching. The whole world was watching, and China sailed it straight through anyway. The US blockade of Iranian ports went into effect on April 13th, hours after peace talks in Islamabad collapsed. Trump's announcement was unambiguous. He said the US Navy would seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that had paid a toll to Iran. He said no one who pays an illegal toll will have safe passage on the high seas. US Central Command issued a formal notice to seafarers confirming the blockade would be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas. All nations. That language was deliberate. It meant China, and China heard it. The Rich Starry made its first attempt on the day the blockade began. It turned around. US naval assets were visible in the strait. The enforcement posture was real, and the ship aborted. Then, in the early hours of the following morning, it tried again. This time it did not turn around. It transited the Strait of Hormuz, passed into the Gulf of Oman, and made it through. No US vessel intercepted it. No warning shots were fired. No boarding took place. The ship, owned by a company the US Treasury had sanctioned in 2023, specifically for trading with Iran, crewed by Chinese nationals carrying Iranian origin cargo, under a flag that the flag state itself says is fraudulent, sailed past the United States Navy and nothing happened. CENTCOM put out a statement saying no ships made it past the blockade in the first 24 hours and that 6 merchant vessels had complied with direction from US forces to turn around. BBC Verify then identified 4 Iran-linked vessels and 3 sanctioned ships that had emerged from the strait after enforcement began. The Rich Starry was one of them. CENTCOM declined to comment specifically on the Rich Starry. The ship's owner, Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping, could not be reached. The US Treasury had this company on its sanctions list. The US Navy had 21 warships in the region, and the tanker sailed through. Before getting to what China did diplomatically and what it said publicly, understand what the Rich Starry represents operationally. It is not one ship. It is the visible tip of an entire shadow fleet infrastructure that China has been building and operating for years, specifically to evade US sanctions on Iranian oil. China's official customs records have shown 0 imports from Iran every year since 2022, yet its recorded crude imports from Malaysia in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, which is more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. That mathematics does not work unless a significant portion of what China is recording as Malaysian crude is actually Iranian crude relabeled through ship-to-ship transfers in international waters off the coast of Malaysia, Oman, and elsewhere. The Lloyd's List Maritime Intelligence Agency reported in late March that 26 vessel transits through the strait had followed routes pre-approved under an IRGC toll booth system, requiring ship operators to submit to Iranian vetting and pay tolls of up to $2 million per transit. China's ships were among those using that system. The Rich Starry's specific tactics on the day of the blockade tell you how sophisticated this operation is. The vessel had been spoofing its AIS transponder position for 11 days before the transit, meaning its publicly broadcast GPS coordinates did not match its actual location. Tracking data from marine traffic showed that when the ship began its voyage out of the strait, it was broadcasting the message China owners and crew in its AIS signal, apparently unconcerned about advertising its national affiliation. It navigated north of the strait through Iranian territorial waters, following the IRGC-controlled transit corridor that routes vessels around Larak Island, where Iranian military personnel conduct cargo verification and clearance. This is the toll booth in operation. The ship paid the toll, followed the Iranian-approved route through Iranian territorial waters, and exited into the Gulf of Oman. The US blockade was specifically designed to stop this. It did not stop this. Now go to what China was doing at the same moment on the diplomatic and political level, because the military and the diplomatic moves are part of the same strategy. The day the blockade took effect, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun held a press conference and said directly that the US action was a dangerous and irresponsible move that would only aggravate confrontation, escalate tension, undermine the already fragile ceasefire, and further jeopardize safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. He said China believes only a complete ceasefire can fundamentally create conditions for easing the situation, and urged all parties to honor the ceasefire agreement and take concrete actions to de-escalate. That statement is calibrated. It sounds like a call for peace. What it actually is China telling the United States that it considers the blockade illegitimate and does not intend to be bound by it. Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun went further. He issued a statement saying, "We have trade and energy agreements with Iran. We expect others not to interfere in our affairs. The Strait of Hormuz is open to us." That is not diplomatic language. That is China telling the United States, in the plainest terms available, that it does not recognize American authority to close a waterway that China considers essential to its national interest, and that it intends to keep using it regardless of what the US military does. And then, on April 7th, before the blockade even took effect, China and Russia together vetoed the United Nations Security Council resolution that Bahrain had proposed on behalf of the Gulf states. That resolution had been weakened 3 separate times to try to get Chinese and Russian abstention. The final version did not authorize military force. It did not assign blame to Iran. It simply called for coordinated efforts to ensure safe navigation and reaffirmed the right of states to defend their vessels from attack. 11 of 15 Security Council members voted for it. China and Russia vetoed it anyway. China's UN envoy said adopting such a resolution when the US was threatening the survival of a civilization would send the wrong message. The Iranian ambassador praised the veto. The US ambassador condemned it. To understand why China is doing this, you need to understand what is at stake for Beijing in purely material terms, because China's position on the Strait of Hormuz is not ideological. It is economic and strategic in the most direct sense. China receives approximately 1/3 of its total oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. In 2024, 84% of all crude oil and condensate shipments through the strait were destined for Asian markets, and China was the single largest recipient. Over 40% of China's total oil import requirements flow through that 21-mile channel. Close the strait effectively, and you cut China's energy supply at the artery. The IMF estimates Iran's fiscal break-even oil price at between $121 and $124 per barrel. China buys Iranian crude at approximately $60 per barrel after discount, a 50% reduction from market price that has been flowing into China's refineries for years through the shadow fleet infrastructure described above. China holds approximately 1.3 billion barrels of strategic oil reserves, enough for roughly 120 days of supply. It can absorb a disruption. It cannot absorb a permanent one. The 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership that China and Iran signed in 2021, which covers energy, infrastructure, trade, and security cooperation, is the framework China's defense minister was referencing when he said their agreements with Iran are sovereign and non-negotiable. Under that agreement, China committed to investing up to $400 billion in Iran over 25 years in exchange for deeply discounted Iranian oil. The US blockade directly threatens that arrangement. China is not going to abandon a $400 billion investment framework because Donald Trump announced a blockade on Truth Social. The US response to China's defiance has been constrained in ways that reveal the structural difficulty of what Washington is trying to do. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called China an unreliable partner for continuing to hold and import Iranian oil instead of helping ease the global energy shortage caused by the strait closure. That framing China as a partner failing to cooperate, rather than China as an adversary actively undermining a US military operation, tells you exactly how carefully the Trump administration is managing its messaging on this. Directly accusing China of breaking the blockade risks a confrontation with nuclear-armed Permanent Security Council member in the middle of an already active war, during a period when Trump has a state visit to China scheduled for next month. CENTCOM declining to comment specifically on the Rich Starry transit is not an accident. It is a decision. The Asia Times described the situation directly. Whether the US would pursue the same enforcement action against a Chinese-linked vessel as it would against a Venezuelan-linked vessel is another matter entirely. In December and January, U.S. naval and Coast Guard ships boarded and seized multiple vessels linked to Venezuela's shadow fleet for breaking the blockade. Those operations, grouped under Operation Southern Spear, involve ships from a country with no nuclear weapons, no permanent UN Security Council seat, and no trade relationship with the United States significant enough to complicate the political calculus. China is none of those things. Iran, for its part, has understood and exploited this constraint from the beginning. When Iran's foreign minister announced on March 26 that ships from 5 specific nations, including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be permitted to transit the strait without restriction, it was constructing a coalition of states with economic interest in Iranian oil access and political interest in not being subject to US enforcement. China, which imports more Iranian oil than any other country, was at the top of that list. Iran then extended similar arrangements to Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines in the weeks that followed. The effect is to give China and other major economies a bilateral arrangement with Iran that runs parallel to and directly contradicts the US blockade framework. Ships from these countries can transit through the IRGC toll booth system, pay Iran's fee, and move their cargo, while the US blockade theoretically applies to all nations. Enforcing that blockade against a Chinese ship means either confronting China directly or admitting the blockade has exceptions that undermine its stated universality. The Jerusalem Post analysis put the strategic situation clearly. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for 120 days. Beijing can survive without Iranian crude for a significant period if it chooses to. The question the analysis posed is whether China wants to stop importing Iranian crude, while 21 US warships sit between its tankers and their cheapest supplier. The answer the Rich Starry provided is no. China does not want to stop, and China has calculated, correctly based on what happened on April 14th, that the US will not board or fire on a Chinese crude, Chinese-owned vessel, regardless of what its sanctions list or its blockade announcement says. The economic consequences radiating outward from this standoff are global and accelerating. Oil prices surged toward $100 a barrel and briefly above $110 before retreating slightly on ceasefire extension news, currently trading around $98. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the closure of the strait deeply damaging and said getting global shipping moving is vital to ease cost of living pressures. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called it greatly damaging. Air Transat announced a 6% reduction in transatlantic and Caribbean flights through October, citing the unprecedented aviation fuel crisis. Shipping firms that suspended strait operations are watching their competitors who continue to transit under the IRGC toll booth system gain market advantage. The Iranian parliament is drafting legislation that would formally codify the toll requirement into Iranian law, requiring payment from all vessels except those of hostile states, a legal framework Iran intends to present as the permanent governance structure for the waterway after the war ends. That last point is the one that receives the least attention and is potentially the most significant. Iran's goal in this conflict has never been simply to close the strait temporarily. Iran's goal is to emerge from this conflict with internationally recognized or at least practically accepted authority over strait transit, including the right to charge tolls, the right to deny passage to vessels of hostile states, and the right to board and inspect vessels it considers suspicious. The toll booth system that 26 ships had already transited through by late March is not a wartime emergency measure. It is a prototype for what Iran wants to make permanent. China's willingness to use that system, to pay the toll, and follow the Iranian-approved route is implicit recognition of Iranian authority over the waterway, which is exactly what the United States is fighting to prevent. The confrontation between the US and China in the Strait of Hormuz is therefore not just about Iranian oil or the current war. It is about who governs one of the most strategically important choke points on Earth, what rules apply to transit, and whether US naval power can enforce those rules against a country of China's economic and military weight. The Rich Starry's transit on April 14th did not answer that question definitively. It asked for it loudly. In 250,000 barrels of methanol sailing past the United States Navy at dawn, China's defense minister said the Strait of Hormuz is open to us. The Rich Starry proved he meant it. The US Navy watched it happen and said nothing publicly. The ceasefire continues to expire and get extended and expire again. Iran keeps seizing ships and charging tolls. China keeps buying the oil. and the question of who actually controls the most important 21 miles of water on the planet remains, as of today, genuinely unanswered.